start for this first session to just review some of the basics and have a bit of a look at the idea of what the Buddha was talking about with the teaching of Kamma and Rebirth and why it's so important. Okay, so let's take these two topics separately for now. First topic on Kamma. What does Kamma mean? Well, if you were living in ancient India in the time of the Buddha, the word Kamma would be a very, very ordinary word. Okay? And I'll talk more about the historical context a bit later on. But the first thing to understand is that when the Buddha used the word Kamma, he wasn't using a Buddhist word. Right? He wasn't using a particular special religious terminology to talk about something. He was just using an ordinary everyday word, which people used around him in all kinds of contexts. Actually, the most common meaning of Kamma is just work. Okay, or one common meaning of Kamma. Right? So when you say, "Oh, I'm going to go off to work today," you'd say, "I'm going to go off and do my Kamma today." Right? That's what your Kamma is. So it's just an ordinary word. So we don't think of it as being like a specialist religious word. It's an ordinary everyday word. One of the most common words in the language, actually. So this word, which is very common, very everyday, has many different applications and meanings in different contexts. Okay? So the Buddha redefined it, took this word which he found in his culture and he redefined it for his own purposes and within his own system. And of course, very famously, the Buddha defined Kamma as intention. Cetanahang bhikkhave kammang vadami. It is intention that I call Kamma. Okay? So what the Buddha is pointing to here is that our choices, the things that matter in our life, are essentially something which comes from inside ourselves. Okay? So Kamma is not something which is primarily external. The Buddha was internalizing Kamma. What is actually happening in your mind? This becomes the primary thing and the main focus in Buddhism. So Kamma is your intention, and that intention can have an ethical quality to it. Okay? Either good or bad, or kind of neither good nor bad. So it's important to understand that not every choice is an act of karma. Okay? So you're not making karma just every moment of every day, right? Necessarily. For example, you go to the supermarket and you want to buy a drink and you think, should I get apple juice or orange juice? I'm going to choose apple juice rather than orange juice. It's not making any karma, right? It's not an ethical choice. It doesn't matter, okay? But it might be an ethical choice, right? You might think, oh, this orange juice is an organic orange juice, so it was made without killing any insects, so I'll choose that in order to help the environment and to help the living beings. Then it becomes a karmic choice because you're giving it an ethical quality, right? But in and of itself, it's just neutral. It's not making any. It's not an ethical choice. So karma is not just any old intention, but it specifically is those intentions or choices which have an ethical basis to them. Punya bisankhara, apunya bisankhara, and nenja bisankhara is a choice, good choices, bad choices, and neutral or neither good nor bad choices. So when we emphasize this in the Buddha's teachings, one of the things that this means is that Buddhism is a very adult religion. Whether we call it a religion, is it a religion? I don't know. Anyway, whatever Buddhism is, it's for grown-ups. Not to say that kids can't do it as well, okay? It's fine, right? But it's about you being able to make mature and considered choices about your life. Nobody's going to make those choices for you, right? And when we're kids and we're growing up, mum and dad make the choices for us, right? What are we going to do, and so on. Gradually, as we get older, we learn that. You learn how to make choices. You learn what is good and bad. Right? And then when you become an adult, it's up to you to make those decisions. So Buddhism is not for somebody who needs to be told what to do all the time. Right? People come to me and ask me these, is this correct? I don't know what's correct. Why do you expect me to be able to tell you what's right and wrong? Is this right? People come and ask me, I did like this and this, is this right? People say in their meditation, they come and say, I meditated like this, and my mind was very peaceful and my mind was very clear. Is that correct? What a crazy question to ask. You're the one who knows whether the meditation's correct. What's your experience? You can see you made these choices, right? You used your mind in this way, and this was the result. Okay? You can see that this is karma and effect working right in front of your very eyes. So our choices are our own. And we have to be responsible for them. Kamma sakomhi, karma dayado. I am the owner of our karma, we're the heir of our karma. So we can't blame anybody else. We can't. It's very tempting to try to fob off responsibility for our actions, for our choices, for our situation. Blame somebody else. But our karma can end us up in any kind of situation, and wherever we are, it's our choice. What do we do with this? I had a friend a number of years ago who ended up going to prison. And then when he went to prison, I went to see him and, what is it like being in prison? He said, it's all right because my cellmate meditates too, so we get up early in the morning and practice meditation every day. So there he is, in that kind of environment where basically almost all your choice is taken away from you. I mean, you feel completely powerless, right? All of those things that we can do, right? And we have that ability to choose. We live in a free country, right? We can decide what we want to eat, what do you want to read, what do you want to watch on television. You can decide all of these things. And when we're given that choice, how much wisdom do we use in that? How much do we reflect on our choices? How much do we consider, where are these choices leading us? So this idea of karma is the idea that we're making choices based on intentions, ethical intentions, and that these choices have results. Now, on the one hand, this teaching is kind of banal. I mean, we can see that every day. We can see we make choices, and those choices have results. But on the other hand, there's a big problem with this teaching, is that, sometimes it doesn't seem to work all that well, does it? Because you see that there are people who are very good people who do the right thing all the time, and yet they end up in a very bad situation. Maybe they've been a very generous, kind, ethical person, and then they get cancer, right? Or maybe they're a very nasty, evil person, but then they get very rich and live a long, happy, healthy life. And you're thinking, come on, karma, do your job. What are you waiting for? I saw someone did a poster once. It was addressed like a letter. Dear Kamma, I have a list of people that you've missed. And so when we look at it, often it seems very hard to reconcile. How is it that if the results of your karma are so powerful, how come it is that so often it seems that evil triumphs and bad triumphs? So of course one of the issues here is that our scope is too narrow. Right? We're only looking at a very small part of the picture. And when we broaden our vision and broaden the scope that we consider how karma works in, then we can have more of an idea of how these things play out. I'll just give you an example of this, or an analogy, if you like. In Western thought, there's a big problem in science. There's a problem of gravity. And we don't think about that very much these days, but it actually was a huge problem in the development of science. And that is that when we look around us, everything falls down, right? Leaves fall off the trees, we trip and we fall on the ground, rain falls from the sky, everything goes down, everything's under the influence of gravity. What about the stars and the clouds and the moon and the sun? Why don't they fall down? What's up with that, right? Why is it that everything down here falls down, but the things up there don't? Now the obvious explanation is to say, well, there's some kind of force or something that makes things fall down here, let's call it gravity, but that doesn't apply up in the sky, right? So up in the sky things work by different rules. And this is how most of the physicists thought that the world was for a long time. And so this was the great insight of Galileo and then Newton, to realise that actually you can see the same principles of gravity operating in the stars and the moon and the sun, the clouds. Actually the same principles are operating there as operate down here. But it's just that the scope of our perception wasn't great enough to be able to understand that. When we see that, you see, oh, actually, it's not that they're not falling down. Actually, they are falling, but we're seeing it from a different perspective. And gravity works for the moon just as it does for us. And this is one of those things which seems obvious in retrospect, but actually is very, very hard to discern. It's a very subtle thing. And it's the same thing when we're thinking about karma, that this law of cause and effect. If you make good choices, it leads to good results. You make bad choices, it leads to bad results. Intuitively, it's simple and it makes sense, but so many times we see that it seems to be violated. So this is where we need to broaden our scope, right? Look at things from the bigger picture. And that broader scope is where the teachings on rebirth come in. So, what do the teachings... So this is the second part of this teaching on Kamma and rebirth, this is the idea of rebirth. So what's rebirth all about? Well, rebirth is essentially the idea that this thing that we call consciousness, our mind, doesn't stop. Our mind has an energy of its own. It's like a river or a stream of energy. And we see what we see of the mind in our lives and the lives of people around us is we see minds that are embedded or embodied in a physical form. Okay, so we see conscious bodies. The Buddha used the term saviññānika kaya. Yeah, conscious bodies. This is what we see. But this relationship of the consciousness with the body is a contingent one. It happens for a period of time and then it ends. Consciousness moves on. And consciousness is a stream, it's an energy of its own. And that consciousness takes form in many different ways. Sometimes as human beings. So we have all of the conscious beings here in this room. The monks, the lay people. We have the cat who's conscious, or at least semi-conscious. Or was conscious a little bit earlier. And one of the teachings of the Buddha made was that there's no kind of hard and fast distinctions here, right? Consciousness is just consciousness. It works pretty much the same in everyone, and even in all the animals. Basically, it works the same way. And this is something which we find is being confirmed so many times in modern science. And we think that we always like to think of ourselves as so much better than animals, right? And we think that all these things that people can do, that animals can't. But the more that the biologists and the psychologists research it, the more that they break down all of those barriers. And in fact, it's very, very hard to find anything at all that humans do that animals can't also do. Obviously not to the same degree or whatever, but still the same innate abilities are there. They even, recent research on, this one came out just a couple of weeks ago, on the way that dogs process language. Right? And they did like MRI tests on dogs' brains when they're listening to language calls, and it's of course something that pet owners know very well, right? But dogs will actually, they use the same kinds of centres in their brain when they're hearing language that humans do. Right? So they actually process language in a way that's similar to humans do. So they are actually hearing and understanding things. Yeah, I mean, if you own a dog, you knew that, right? But it takes a while to be able to see exactly what's going on from a scientific point of view. So this idea of rebirth is the idea that consciousness moves on and takes form and takes shape in many different ways. And all this is, if we come back, we look at the basic principle, what exactly is going on here is nothing more than what in science they call the conservation of energy. And so in science, of course, one of the basic principles, laws of thermodynamics, is that energy is neither created nor destroyed, it's merely transformed. Right? So in Buddhism, same thing applies. In Buddhism, the idea of what we call energy in modern times, in the word in Buddhism is sankhara. Okay? And so sankharas are just the energies. And so the Buddha, I believe, was the first philosopher, or the first person to talk about the world, the whole world, everything that we know being made up just of energies that are in constant, ceaseless change. So rather than thinking of the world as being things, the Buddha thought of the world as being energies, processes, and sankharas. And these processes, one of these processes, a very important one, is the process of Kamma. Kamma also just meaning energy. So a Kamma is like an energy which drives our consciousness from one life to the next. We make those choices, you think about it, you think about how powerful that ethical choices are. Right? If you've ever, think about when you last time you did something really bad, really nasty, the nastiest thing that you did. I know it'll be very hard for most of you to think of something, but you think back and then afterwards you think how bad it made you feel. Yeah? And how deeply it affects your mind to know that you did that and you hurt so many people and it was such a terrible thing to do. And then you think about the good things that you do. Yeah? And when you do something good, how empowering that is to sit down to meditate, or to do an act of kindness for somebody, or to share something with somebody, to give something up. And how powerful that is. It transforms your life. So this is what that Kamma is. It's creating energy which gives a direction and a focus for our consciousness. So these two teachings on Kamma and rebirth are very, very much intertwined. If we don't use it, if we don't bring the idea of rebirth in, then Kamma will never make sense. Because cause and effect will always work, it'll always play out, but it doesn't always play out in this life. Sometimes it takes longer. And sometimes we can see that we do Kamma and it will have a result here and now. Often it has a result immediately, doesn't it, right? You do something, maybe you feel good straight away. There you go, Kamma and effect, cause and effect happening right before your eyes. Sometimes it might not be immediate, it might be quite some time later, you know? And, for example, like it might be a book I wrote, years ago, 10 years ago, and then, somebody will send me an email and say, oh, I just read your book and I loved it so much. And so I think, it makes me feel good. At least one person has read my book, made it all worthwhile. So sometimes it's delayed for a while, right? But then maybe it might be delayed for many, many years, and maybe it's delayed for even many lifetimes. So again, according to Buddhism, this energy of consciousness doesn't stop, it merely changes. That's what we call dependent origination. And it keeps on going lifetime after lifetime. There's no beginning to that. So, how much good Kamma have we made in the past? How much bad Kamma have we made in the past? We don't really know. Right? What's waiting around the corner? Right? We think, oh, we've made so much good karma in our life, done so many good things, but we don't know what we did in our last life. Maybe the reason why we're doing good karma in this life is because unconsciously we know we did so many bad things in our last life. So we have to make up for it as best we can. Yeah? Sometimes this is how people are, isn't it? Yeah? And you see sometimes with business people that do that sometimes. They might be very ruthless in their job and they might exploit people and so on, but then they get later in life, they feel remorse for it, and then they do all this charity work and give all the money they gave away. Right? So you're beginning to realise, beginning to understand. So it's very, very important to keep coming back to this idea. Karma is choice. Choice is just an energy. It's an energy which shapes your consciousness and moves your mind. You go from one life to the next, on and on and on. We can't predict where we're going to be. We can't predict how the karma will play out. But we do know that if we make those right choices, we make good choices, it will have good results. Bad choices will have bad results. And we understand that principle, and we can use that as a guide for our life. So this is that basic teaching on karma and rebirth. Right? So the most fundamental principle. And it's very, very important that as we keep going with this course, and we keep going with this series of talks on karma and rebirth, that you bear in mind this basic definition and basic understanding of what it's about. Because if we misunderstand what the basic idea is about, then we'll misconstrue the whole teaching on karma and rebirth. So what I want to do for this series of talks is to cover a number of different areas to try to explore the topic of karma and rebirth from different perspectives. And so we will look at things like, one of the things I want to do is to look at some of the myths that surround the idea of karma and rebirth. Okay, so by myths I mean like the popular ideas that people have, and the kind of the things which may be in a Buddhist culture, but actually the teaching on karma is not really a Buddhist teaching anymore, is it? Yeah, it's actually a global teaching. Yeah. And it's one of the ideas which has entered into a world vocabulary. Yeah, so we have to use the word karma because it's actually in the English dictionary now. It's actually an English word, right? And if you can go on like an internet site and have if you make a good comment or something like that, then you'll have good karma, right? And you'll get karma points because of that. And so the word karma is sort of so integrated into the way people think. And so because it's so integrated in the way people think, it tends to accumulate all of these myths and ideas, and we want to try to bust a few of these myths. So we'll do it as one session to talk about that. Another thing that I'd like to do is we'll spend some time looking at the suttas, looking at what the Buddha taught about karma and rebirth. Another thing I'd like to do is to spend some time looking at the cultural background in the time of the Buddha. Who was he talking to? Why did he frame his teaching in that way? Well, unless we understand something about the culture at the time of the Buddha, it's impossible for us to know how that teaching on karma should be applied in our current day. And when I'm talking to you, because you've been brought up in the modern education and so on, so I can use examples from science or from psychology, or I can cultural things that we're familiar with. Okay. And this is the way that we can communicate, because we have a shared body of ideas that so we can understand each other. And in the Buddha's time it was the same, but it was a different shared understanding, a different culture, different time, a different place, different concerns. And the meaning of the karma needs to be understood in that culture. If we don't understand it in the context, we'll never know how to apply it in this context. As well as those things, so we'll look at the busting some of the myths. We'll look at what the Buddha taught about karma and rebirth in the suttas. We'll look at the culture in the time of the Buddha. We will also look at some of the evidence around karma and rebirth. Okay, so this teaching on rebirth is not something which is very easy to verify, is it? So death is hidden by a veil, and a veil that is very difficult to pierce, okay? Unless you're willing to, make the ultimate sacrifice for the sake of science, but very few people seem to be willing to do that, right? So this is something we'll have a look at, is what's the evidence around the topics of rebirth. This is very interesting. I'd also like to spend some time looking at some of the deeper implications of the topic of karma and rebirth, how it relates to the Buddhist philosophy, the Buddhist teachings on liberation, enlightenment, how it relates to the Eightfold Path and dependent origination. So we'll look at some of those things a little bit later on. But for the remainder of this first session, what I'd like to do is to outline for you some of the methods that I'm going to be using and some of the principles that we're going to be applying to try to learn to understand the teaching on karma. Now, of course, here as we're discussing Dhamma in a Buddhist context, most important thing is we first of all we ask, well, what did the Buddha say? Okay. What was the Buddha's teachings on karma? And we're very fortunate that we have a large body of teachings where the Buddha talks about karma from many different perspectives. So these teachings are what these days we call the early Buddhist texts, and these are what I will mainly be relying on. And so those teachings are mainly the four Nikayas in the early parts of the Pali Canon, together with the parallels of those texts that we find in Chinese translation, some Sanskrit texts, some Tibetan texts. So in all of these collections we find that there are a mixture of earlier and later teachings, and we need to learn to use our discernment to be able to understand what it is that the Buddha actually taught and what he didn't teach. Even within the early teachings, we find that there's a very swift and radical shift in how karma and rebirth is taught. And this happens even within, say, the period of composing the Pali Canon. And in the early teachings, the teachings given by the Buddha himself, we find that the teachings on karma, of course, are very rational, very reasonable, very nuanced. And yet within, even by the time the Pali Canon was finished being compiled, we find all these kind of later ideas being introduced. Just to give you one example of what I mean is some text in the Pali Canon called the Vimana Wattu and Beta Wattu, which gives stories of the tales of the heavens and the ghost realm, the hungry ghost realm. And in there you find sort of ideas, for example, that like if somebody gives dana to one of the monks, then immediately as they give the dana, then a heavenly mansion will kind of pop up in the sky, right? Ready for them, right? So that they have their mansion just sort of magically appears there. Well, I don't know about you, but we've got satellites and things these days, and we can't find a lot of heavenly mansions popping up into the sky. So I'm not really sure whether that's actually what the Buddha was meaning when he was talking about karma and rebirth. And also find the very notion of karma has become very narrowed. In the early Buddhist teachings, there's a very broad idea of what constitutes good action. Right? And but then in those later texts, it becomes often very narrowed. It's only just giving to monks is all that's mentioned as being a good action. And of course that's one of the things we can do as good karma, but there are of course many, many, many other things as well. So here we can see that there was shifts in this teaching of karma even within the few hundred years that it took to compile the Pali Canon. So we need to learn to distinguish between what's earlier and what's later, between the things which the Buddha himself taught and the things which are accepted and passed down by the tradition. In addition to that, we also need to have an inquiring mind. The the suttas say, and we're very familiar with this from the Kalama Sutta and other places, it says, anusavena, don't believe on something just because it was passed down by the tradition, right? Just because it's part of the oral tradition. Na Pitaka Sampadena, don't accept things just because it's included in the Pitaka. So this attitude towards knowledge, I believe, is as far as I'm aware, is unique in all of the world's religions. I don't know of another religion where the scriptures themselves are saying you should be skeptical about these scriptures. And this is not something which is just a kind of a passing comment or just a one-off comment in one sutta, but in fact it's a theme which is developed at great length in quite a number of different suttas. And for example, we have the Vimamsaka Sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya, where the Buddha actually gives very extensive instructions to his disciples on how to investigate him. Right? He's saying, "This you should investigate me." Right? He's not saying you should blindly believe everything I say. He's saying you should investigate me, and says this is how you should investigate me. And he gives a program. How do you actually test your teacher? Right? Does he act in accordance with his beliefs? Right? Does he tell us to get rid of greed, hatred and delusion, but then he himself acts out of greed, hatred and delusion? Right? These are the kinds of things you should be testing me on. Right? So many of you, you're working or something like that. When was the last time that your bosses gave you a manifesto saying, you should test me? Right? This is how you should evaluate your boss at work. Right? Here's a list of things you should do, and you should see, do I live up to these standards? Right? Has your bosses ever given you anything like that? No? If any of you are the bosses at your workplace, thank you very much for that timely reminder of impermanence. That's excellent. So if any of you are bosses at your workplace, have you done that? Right? If not, you should. Right? You can go home and write out a manifesto. This is for all your employees. This is how you should test me. See whether I'm a good boss or not. And then, it's unthinkable. And many other suttas as well, where the Buddha teaches in a similar way. So he always said you should test what he's saying. And there's a very beautiful saying which we find in the suttas, which is just hidden away in a little corner of the suttas, and it's not really something which is mentioned very much. But one part of the suttas, and the Buddha gives various problems and various antidotes. Okay? And many of them are the kinds of things you might expect, right? So he says if you have anger, then you do loving kindness to overcome that. Right? If you have wandering mind, then you can do like breath meditation to calm your mind down. And so he gives these different kind of antidotes for different problems. And one of the interesting ones that he talks about, he says, is doubt. Okay, so he says, what is the antidote for doubt? Now immediately, if you thought of that, immediately you think, well, the antidote for doubt must be faith, right? That's the opposite of doubt, is faith. But that's not what the Buddha says. The Buddha says the antidote for doubt is inquiry. Right? The antidote for doubt is inquiry. Very interesting, isn't it? Because very often we think exactly the opposite. We think that inquiry is what leads to doubts. And this is what I've been told this many times. People tell me, oh, you're giving rise to doubts in people and so on. You have to believe everything that the Buddha said and so on. This is not what the Buddha was saying. You have to inquire. And so if we want to find the truth, we have to start out by saying, well, we look at what the suttas, we learn what they have to say, and then we ask the question, is it true? Right? Is that really how the world is? Some things that we find in the suttas are not true. Right? I mean, the suttas say that there's like a Mount Meru, which is like 84,000 leagues high or something like that. I'm not sure if the suttas say how high Mount Meru is, but anyway, they have this mythology of Mount Meru. Well, there isn't a Mount Meru. And so there are things which we find there which they don't correspond to the physical world that we know. But of course these are just incidental details, they're not very important. But if we look at those things which are really important and central to the teachings, we need to take that attitude of, well, are there things which are these things true? We can't live our life just kind of believing in what somebody's told us. We have to learn to be able to inquire and to test things. And so this teaching on karma and rebirth is so important, it's so crucial, that we just can't just leave it up to chance. We just can't just leave it up to blind faith. We must inquire and we must test it. So we take these teachings, we look at what the Buddha said, we ask, is it reasonable? Does it make sense? Does it agree with the evidence? Does it agree with our experience? And so this is the final criteria, and the ultimate criteria for everything in Buddhism is, well, what is your experience? Now we can talk all day about the theory of karma, right? And we can look at the Buddha's teachings on consciousness and ethics and things like that. We can look at the different evidences for rebirth and stories of people being reincarnated and so on and so forth. And these things are all very kind of interesting and very fascinating, but actually, what difference does it make? How does it change our lives? I think that the most significant thing about the teaching on karma is that the teaching on karma is very empowering. The teaching on karma says that you can make a difference. The teachings on karma says that you are not trapped. You are not the prisoner of your destiny. I mean, this is one of the biggest myths about karma, right? That karma means destiny. That karma, in fact, means the exact opposite of destiny or fate. Right? Karma means choice. So when we understand that teaching on karma, we don't feel trapped. Right? You don't feel that somehow your life is being controlled by forces that you have no understanding of. But on the contrary, we know that wherever we are, whatever situation that we're in, we can make a choice. Right? We can make a choice. We can choose to do what's right. We can choose to do what's wrong. And having made that choice, we will reap the consequences of that. Right? Again, this comes back to that idea that Buddhism is a mature religion, a religion for adults. So you find that there's very little in Buddhism that's coercive. Okay? Practically nothing. And so if we're familiar with the Christian tradition, I was brought up as a Catholic, then the Christian tradition, it always is thou shalt not. Right? Thou shalt not. Yeah? Somebody's telling you what to do. Somebody's telling you what's right and wrong. Okay? And that's fine if you're 10. If you're 10, you need somebody to say this is right and this is wrong. Because you don't know, you don't understand. But by the time you're maybe 13 or 14, you're getting an idea. And by the time you're 16 or 17 or 18, where you're allowed to drive and you're allowed to go to war and you're allowed to vote, right? And you're allowed to start a family, so surely you should be allowed, you should have an understanding of what's right and wrong by that time. So once we're grown-ups, we know what's right and wrong. We should be able to choose. So from the Buddhist point of view, our precepts, our choices of what to do and what's right and wrong is not based on thou shalt or thou shalt not. It's based on sikkhapadang samadhiyami. Right? I will undertake the way of training. Right? Samadhiyami. First person, singular, present tense. For those of you who know Pali. Right? First person, I. Right? It's singular. It's not me. It's not we. I can't be responsible for what other people do. I undertake it. Right? It's an active verb. It's in the present tense. This is what I am doing now. So this is our karma. It's the choice that we make, and it's that choice to choose to do good or to do bad. Okay, so I think that should be enough for the first session. So let's call it a halt here and have a bit of a break, and then we'll come back for the second session.